I will start showing some concepts that I think are pretty important to have clear in mind so you can actually get results and start moving forward with the way you sound and the way you make decisions. For that, you need certain criteria and some listening skills that you can develop over time. So today we will be playing with the stock EQ in Reaper, trying to work around some ideas of what balance really means, why numbers don't matter, and why maybe your stock EQ could be enough until it's not enough. Straight from Mexico City, my name is Juanchis, and today I did this example. Honestly, there are so many types of music that I cannot make enough videos to show it in every single style. So please bear that in mind and remember that the most important thing is the concept that I'm talking about. The DAW doesn't matter, the plugin doesn't matter, the numbers don't matter. What I want you to try and understand is the fact that there is a concept that I'm using to start making choices of where I'm going, in what state my work is, and how to move forward. If anything goes wrong, you can always go backward following the steps because you have a criteria. So what are EQs? Let's start with something like that. Usually any EQ video would start telling you that you have a specific channel strip that you have to use because it sounds analog or warm or whatever words they are trying to use to describe it. But one of the perspectives on how to look at equalizers is that you can handle what the other person is paying attention to. This is crucial for me because you are handling the relationship of the instrument itself, and with that you're handling a lot of the articulation, and you can put up front some things that might not be as useful for the sound itself, because you can lower and control stuff that aren't as useful or that are getting in the way of other things, or you can bring forward things that deserve attention. I will link in the description a book by Professor Alex Case that I think it's basic for anyone trying to understand mixing, but the mindset of the 3 Fs for me works in every single stage. And that is, don't do anything, don't add anything, don't cut anything unless you're trying to fix something, you're trying to feature something, or you're trying to fit it with everything around it. That's the whole mindset that we're going to work with. So, in EQs, if you don't have the actual channel strip by SSL, it doesn't matter. The stock EQ on Reaper is this one, the ReaEQ, but you can also use this one, the ReaEQ, that you can download from the Rea pack. And it's pretty much the same. It has almost every single feature. I don't remember by heart if it's missing something. But the whole idea of this one is you have enough bands to do stuff. You can right-click any of those and you can use shelves, bands, low pass. And let's start talking about that. One of the things that I find fascinating about equalizers is that you can actually push and pull things out when you need to bring something to the attention of the listener, or you want it to not get in the way of something else. And it brings a certain excitement to the performance and whatever they are listening to. You might need, or you might feel like you might need a certain channel strip to get that warmth analog thing that no one knows what that means. Absolutely no one knows what that means. Because if you could actually put a definition to it, probably you need a big test group, and it has been tested that most audio engineers don't even agree on the words for describing certain kind of audio content. So why is this equalizer different? We will explore that idea as well. Probably your stock EQ is more than enough. Let's start with the edges of the frequency spectrum. When you're dealing with the lowest part of the spectrum, you have to remember that this is a phrase that I've been using for years while teaching. Not all frequencies are the same. This means so many things that are not the usual first phrase when someone is trying to teach you EQ. I know they need different amounts of energy. We know that we have the equal loudness curves by Fletcher and Monson, and that we don't listen to all of the frequencies at the same perceived loudness. I know that, we know that. That's not the subject. The thing that I'm trying, or one of the things that I'm trying to say when I'm talking about not all frequencies are the same, is that we have to think about the spacing also regarding tuning. So if I had a specific note right here, for example, A1, A2, A3, and A4, just to have a small example, the distance that I have between notes, music notes, when I'm moving across the frequency spectrum, starts getting bigger. That means that any movement that I make has to be a lot more precise in the lower frequency range. Because from A1 to A2, I have 44 hertz, something like that. From here up, I have 110, because remember that every octave is times 2. From here up, it's 220. From here up, it's 440. And it starts increasing in big ways. So maybe if I'm cutting something up here, and I do something like this, I may be impacting half an octave, but if I move that same bandwidth towards the lower register, here I'm affecting the whole octave, and that's really important. For example, in a bass guitar or in your bass instrument, if you're just trying to control something, it's really important for your fundamental tone of the song itself to actually be felt clearly. That's why you might want to adjust a lot the Q factor and just try to control whatever is necessary that's getting in the way for this part of the octave to be heard and this part of the octave to be heard. So sometimes it sounds even silly, and I'm not trying to say that you have to calculate it every time, but you might want to check the tone of the song if something is simply not working, and check if you're not cutting the fundamental note of the track itself, because that's what doesn't make it hit sometimes. It never really gets home, if that makes any sense. That means that all of our critical EQ moves have to be a lot more precise the lower we are in the register, because up top we have less impact on the whole octave that we are trying to EQ. For example, if I'm trying to EQ something that is a problem in this part of the octave because the instrument is doing something strange, whenever I take this note to other places, visually it does match, because I have a visual representation that is not logarithmic and it's not spacing out, as not always every single EQ might show it. And that's really important, because visually you might think, when you're trying to understand EQ, that your movement is pretty much the same thing, but even though I'm fakely affecting only one octave down here, up here I'm not covering the whole octave. It will probably be something closer to this, when down here I'm doing something closer to this amount of movement, right? So that brings us to a really hard question related to our bandwidths, and our Q factor is only how many frequencies next to our center frequency are we affecting. There's this big suggestion from audio engineering that I think it works. I've seen it work for years, that most of the movements when you're boosting should be a little bit wider regarding EQ, because our ear is better at catching resonances, because you're bringing all of the attention only to this, instead of bringing the attention to this section of the instrument, if that makes any sense. And when we are cutting, if I'm taking all of this from the instrument, I'm probably taking way too much, and I'm trying to only take out a little bit of what's getting in the way. Of what's getting in the way, not only with other instruments, but what's also getting in the way from what's closer down to the listening range. Therefore, we can go and try to explore the edges, the actual edges, and the two types of filters that we will most likely use when we are dealing with EQ. Shelves that look like this, and for these video purposes, let's just call these pass filters. Not all pass filters, like high pass and low pass. So the thing is, whenever you're hitting the lowest note of a bass guitar, for example here at E1, around 42 hertz, the problem is, if I set it up right here, there might be some extra rumble that I don't need for this to move so hard. Maybe I could try changing the slope of it and going a little bit lower and try to control it. My suggestion is I'm kind of aggressive in this. So whenever you're high passing, I would suggest for you to start with a 12 dB per octave high pass filter and start a little bit under the frequency that you're trying to get properly, because by this moment the filter has barely touched or reduced a little bit. I know that with EQ you can generate this natural bump that some analog EQs do, so you can compensate it. It's not a problem. You can fix it with your Q factor, but bring it a little bit down. That way you won't need to maybe cut that 41 hertz with an extra bump right there, because this will also eventually hit any dynamic processing or non-linear processing. If you need to move a little bit higher, you might want to try stronger slopes and compensating it. And I'm not giving any kind of user manuals on how to do these things. Eventually, your ear will start getting trained on why is that sounding right or why is it not. Because if you even try to replicate the movement of something like a Pultec EQ, it will probably look something like this, like something like that when you're like boosting 30 hertz and cutting at the same time in the same band. So sometimes these movements are the actual results of analog EQs. But for high passing, you might want to try first 12 dB per octave, then 24 if it's not sounding properly. You might even listen to an extra tightness of the kick drum where it's very clear the hit itself. Or if you want to loosen it up, you might want to try a 6 dB per octave and just use this as some sort of control. And this is a criteria that I really want to share with you. If I'm using a shelf EQ right here, the difference is that I'm only controlling because I'm not cutting completely this out. And also the phase interaction that I'm having with this shelf EQ is not as invasive if I'm doing a shelf EQ where I'm maybe just controlling for 6 dB something instead of having this on a 12 dB per octave and having it right here. Because all of this extra information might be moved into places that I don't really need. And the problem is not one single track. The problem starts when you have 15, 20, 30 tracks with EQs with high pass on them. So for this criteria or for this mindset between choosing a pass filter or a shelf filter, my best suggestion is try to figure out honestly, when you're just looking at some spectrum, if this information that you are watching is actually a problem because this is way too close. Visually, you can even see that it's really close to the rest of the peaks in your signal, or if it's not really a problem. If it's just something about tone shaping, I would go with a shelf filter. If it's something like this is a low end that I really don't need because the room was rumbling in some way, then yes, I would high pass it. But my shelf EQs would probably work better as some sort of big tone shapers where I want a little bit more highs or a little bit more lows. Remember that whenever you take out lows, you instantly listen more to the highs because that's what's left in the audio track, and the other way around. If you're dealing with the edges of your sound, that's a nice suggestion. If you're dealing with the high end, honestly, low passing sometimes works in certain styles. It really works. For example, if you have some guitars where the bass of the amp is really messing around with you, you might want to try something harder. But please remember that equal loudness curves show us that any strong movements that you do, the closer you are to this 5K zone, will be a lot more noticeable by your ear. That's extremely important because if you're just trying to really narrow down what your instrument range is according to some graph that doesn't make sense and that doesn't matter, probably you will end up with a lot of missing information, especially if you're dealing with recorded music using microphones. In the sample music making world, some of these suggestions might be a little bit more flexible, but probably the air of the room itself, of the ambience itself, could be useful for that feeling of integration. And that has nothing to do with the glue that people talk about with master bass compression and saturation and such. This simply has to do with letting the brain know that those microphones belong in the same space and they are integrated by the same source and they were recorded at the same time. It's just giving extra information that's not too obvious, but it's there. With the other kind of filters that we usually use, for example, peak parametrics, these pretty much work in the rest of the area or the frequency range that we have. And the only suggestions big that I might have is to try and start mapping out. I will have videos on it, but this as a first video is a suggestion to try and start mapping out what is actually coming from the instrument itself. I know there are a couple of videos trying to use some specific language that I think is much more precise when we're talking about something is being boomy, something being nasal and such, but maybe we can start thinking about it per instrument and you will have more perspectives. You can feel or you can listen to a whole mix being boomy or bright or harsh or hollow, but whenever you're thinking of an instrument in relationship with the others or within itself, you might want to bring out more of the wood of the instrument. You might want to bring more of the fingers on the guitar. You might want to reduce the body of the acoustic guitar because there was some proximity effect during the recording, and you might just want to control it a little bit instead of cutting it completely because that doesn't let the low end feel completely full. That's part of the perspective that I want to start sharing. Part of the art of balance for me has to do with really understanding how you can plan out the depth of your mix. First, only using faders. I'm going to lower everything that I have on, and the only peak level that I will actually worry about is my first drums because these are usually the most dynamic, and with that, I will try to peak around -12 to -6 maybe, because I know I can still compress them, I know I can still control those peaks, and I can earn a little bit more space. And once I have my kick drum or my snare or whatever instrument you're setting as a reference at the level that you need it, you can start building on top of it and behind it. That's why usually when you're making balance, solo button is the most useless thing in the world. Let's start balancing this thing out. I'm going to try and set up my bass drum and my snare. That's like the first thing I'm trying to get right. And since I know that my bass drum could sometimes be clickier and sometimes could be darker, I don't care about the number. How does it sound in relationship to some sort of level? For me, that even works as a starting point. I'm going to start leveling things out, and I don't care about the numbers. I'm trying to get always enough kick drum. Then I want the snare to pop out a little bit from that, and I will start building around it. This clip right here, I really don't care because it's not coming out of the track itself, and besides, that wouldn't actually clip. So that's why I'm not worrying about that. My actual level of my auxiliary drums or my drum bus is this one, -2. In any case, as I said, I would just give some extra space for it. So I will drag it down 4 dBs so it'd be closer to -6. For example, musically, this bass line that I made is really melodic, so it's important for it to be not lost, because that bass specifically is not trying to only support the kick drum. So since it's fulfilling a more melodic feature as well, I'm going to push it a little bit more. And as far as I see it, two things are happening here. Whenever I push it too hard, then I have too much of the high end or too little of the low end, and that unbalance could not work. But I'm not EQing just yet for the instrument itself. So I have to make a decision. What do I want? Do I want a lower fader position, and then with my EQ having to increase whatever I was missing because it's low, it's under the level that I actually need it? Or do I want the lower part of the bass to actually be under the kick drum, and then I can concentrate on what's the relationship of the high end of the bass? That's the high end is 700 to 1.5 kilohertz, and maybe make my decision around that. Of course, for those keys, we could sidechain them and use that as part of the effect. But right now, I really want to concentrate on the concept of balance. I know I can make more space eventually. I know I can. But if I just start plugging a sidechain EQ, I'm missing part of the feeling of how are things related to each other and how they are feeling the part of the soundscape that I'm building. For this specific scenario, what I want is the feeling that everything is at a certain maximum level, and whenever I do any dynamic movement, for example, sidechain EQ or multiband compression or expansion, I want it to move with a specific range from what I already set it. That's why I'm never worried about pushing that zero as fast as I can, because I want to have some space for things to eventually pop up a little bit more, because that might be interesting from time to time. So I want my keys to be around my kick drum and right behind my snare drum. And since it's mostly on the sides, it won't be too much of an issue with the bass, or it shouldn't be too much of a problem with the bass. And I know they are sharing a lot of information in the lower mids 200 hertz range with the rest of my instruments. I know so, but I'm not worried because I can EQ it and carve a little bit so they fit better. And that has nothing to do with just instantly applying sidechain or automating the level of my track. I'm going to leave my vocal out for the moment because it's quite repetitive and I don't think it's way too useful for this video in particular. Let's try and make things work with a couple of EQs. I'm going to use the stock EQ. That's the only thing that I will be using because I think many times this is pretty much all of the EQs that we necessarily need. And there is a difference with channel strip EQs that I love, but there is a difference. I'm going to first try to have both of these. I have my bass right here, and I'm going to give myself more space horizontally so I can work better on my frequency range. Just because of what I was saying about the slopes, I'm going to have my two EQs right here. So I'm going to try and maybe move around G because this small instrumental thingy is in G. So I'm going to move closer to that. Lucky for us, we have this information always at hand. And my lowest G would be around 40 something hertz, 47, something like that. And as I said, I will be working with a 12 dB first, And here I will be working with another 12. Remember, on the lower side is my bass, and on the upper part, there's my kick drum. There are also many suggestions that say always have your kick drum at certain maximum low frequency. For me, that doesn't make much sense because every kick drum is tuned differently and you have to find where it actually lands. And that's what I'm going to use as a specific key point, so I could anchor to that. And from there, I can decide how to move my bass around it. Why? Because the frequency range of the kick drum is a lot smaller than that of the bass drum. The bass drum is a big low-end mass that's constantly going on. Just for educational purposes, I will use the solo button right here, and I'm going to try and find where most of the low-end information clumps up when the pitch envelope of the kick drum ends. If what I just said doesn't make any sense, let me explain it better. Any percussion in any given time is nothing but a membrane that's being stimulated that has a pitch envelope that comes down 2 octaves, 3 octaves, and stabilizes at a certain frequency. So you cannot ignore how that movement of the frequencies happen. Even though it's a lot smaller right here because you can actually see on the analyzer that, I can change the resolution of my equalizer so you can actually see the slope right here, and look at how you can actually see the slope every time the kick drum hits. You would have two choices right there, because you could leave yourself with this a little bit lower, but that probably is part of the recording with this extra bump that could be part of the room, could be not, but I'm just going to leave it there because that's where I feel it sounds great. And besides the whole other tips that people say that just move some inverted EQs so you give space to one and then on the other, remember that I said that how you impact your octaves with tonal instruments is really important. For the bass, what I will end up doing is probably give myself some space, but on the upper part of the kick drum, in the harmonics of the kick drum. So probably, even though this sounds probably strange, I'm going to move all the way up to 180, more or less, with more or less a narrow EQ, and I'm going to do a big movement first, around 9 dBs. I'm going to bypass it, set it on, and back and forth, and let me know if you can listen to the differences. You can see on screen everything that I'm doing. I will play with the bypass of the kick drum, play with the bypass of the bass, and so on. Another thing that is happening is that since this bass line is not so heavy on the low end, I could even just change this instead of a low cut and turn it into a low shelf and give myself a little bit more space in the lowest register closer to my kick drum. And then I'm going to give this extra body to the bass, taking advantage of the Q factor. And now I have this extra bump that compensates the bass space against the kick drum. And you could even do it small, really, really small. I think it's really clear that things start clumping up again if I'm not doing these really small movements, but I'm thinking of how I'm building and making space for my instruments. all of these decisions have to be made for every single instrument. I remember that my keys take a little bit more space in the lower mids that I might want to clear up, but I'm just going to try a little bit more a harsher slope on my kick drum, and I'm going to try and get that like that low end thump that I really like from kick drums. Because my bass line is really leaving a lot more across the 300, 200 range. That's the MIDI part of this bass sound. If you set it up through another amp and give that extra low end, then it's another decision. For the keys, I will only use the ReaEQ, because the only thing that I might need is a little bit more space where precisely my bass is leaving most of the time. And this will probably let me push a little bit more the fader of my keys as well. This works really well because what I'm doing is I'm letting myself push that bright part of the keys and feel it really close, and even though I'm bringing it closer, I'm not bringing the rest of the dirt that's covering up my kick drum and my bass, instead of just high passing everything. It will sound different, of course it will sound different. And as you can see, I still have plenty of space for my mix to keep building up and for me to even push all of my faders up using one single control fader. If you haven't seen that video on my channel, I highly suggest you to watch it, because I always have a couple of faders that let me move all of my session together. So I can always move my relative level towards my output and how I'm pushing into it. On the next video, I will keep on exploring this idea with other instruments. I will talk about vocals. I will talk more on detail about drums and on keys, because keys are really underestimated, because the frequency decay, the decay per frequency octave is even stranger, because you have usual instruments that can go from an E2 again to an E7, and then it really depends on how you're dealing with that spectrally. It's crazy, it's fun, and I think it might be useful for you to start building some bigger criteria for this. I will only be talking about EQ for a while, trying to use the stock EQ in Reaper most of the time. And we will also explore a lot the idea of why this EQ could be different or could get you to different places instead of just your stock EQ. If you like this kind of videos, be sure to comment, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Straight from Mexico City, my name is Juanchis, and thanks for listening.